Hello everyone, welcome to CloudEagle's session on SOC Compliance along with Girish Redekar, the founder and CEO of Sprinto, an InfoSec compliance automation platform. Welcome Girish.
Thanks, Prasanna. Thanks for having me.
We are very excited to have you here. And in this session, we will cover a few things. We'll definitely go with Girish's background, and then we'll talk about why Girish is building Sprinto and what is Sprinto doing in the InfoSec and the SOC compliance space as such. With that, Girish, can you give a quick background about yourself, your journey till Sprinto?
Yeah, absolutely. Before Sprinto, I actually ran another B2B SaaS company called RecruiterBox. I'm a developer first. So I and my co-founder wrote most of the code at RecruiterBox. We grew it to more than 2,500 customers, most of who were in the US. When we exited the company in 2018, we were growing by about 100 new customers a month. And the reason I give all of that background is during the course of running that company, we had to become compliant with one of these frameworks like SOC 2, ISO, etc. That was the nature of our business. And by virtue of being engineers, these things usually fall into the laps of whoever manages engineering in the company, which was me and my co-founder at the time. And consequently, we got like a front row seat to what these compliances mean, what the gotchas are, where they become painful, etc. I wouldn't say we had a very pleasant experience with this whole thing. We did this the conventional way, hired a consultant, burned tens of thousands of dollars on this. It became extremely painful. It cannibalized a whole bunch of other engineering projects we had in a roadmap. I wouldn't say that the idea to do something around this struck us at the time, but after exiting that company and looking for things to do for an extent, this was one of the things that we could sort of draw upon. And what we try and do at Sprinto quite simply is make this journey as seamless and as painless as possible, specifically for B2B cloud-hosted SaaS companies. And this is an increasing concern. This is a revenue driver for companies, and we believe that companies don't have the right tools and practices in place to do this in a seamless manner. It usually means trading off something that's on your pipeline and becomes extremely painful for engineering teams. Our job is to try and make this as simple as possible. So we basically automate a bunch of things that would otherwise be done manually and help companies get here in a rather painless manner.
Nice. That's great to hear how you're facing this problem in your previous company and you and your co-founder started this. That's really great to hear. Now, with respect to SOC compliance, you're just talking about the journey and the pain which you are facing. What does the typical SOC compliance journey look like for a customer?
Great question. So doing this conventionally is kind of like going through a root canal. It takes, depending on the size of the company, it's first going to take you about, like a few hundred hours, about 300 hours or so, just the 0 to 1 journey where, you're going from wherever you're today to the point where you would implement all the practices and processes that SOC 2 or ISO or any of these compliances require you to implement. And that's going to just suck away a lot of time, effort, and energy out of your product building. So that's the first step. You spend a lot of time, and it's wrought with a lot of troubles. Like you end up just spending a lot of time Googling about this, trying to translate the jargon that's everywhere, etc., and trying to figure out what really does this mean for your company. Then there's a phase where you need to run and operate this program in your environment. And that usually means keeping tabs on about 100 plus practices and processes, making sure you're running these practices and processes on time, every time, without exception, collecting evidence around these practices and processes, which takes the form of screenshots or logs or documentation. Pretty hairy, thing. By itself, it doesn't add too much value, all the document collection, but you need to do it in order to go through an audit. So you're spending again another 300-400 hours a year in this just operation phase. And at the end of this whole thing, you still have to go through an audit, which isn't something that most people will look forward to. It's usually like a conversation between Greek and Latin, where the auditor is speaking a lot of jargon, and it becomes your job to map what it means to the context of your company. There's usually a lot of back and forth about cataloging all the evidence you have collected, formatting it correctly, making it meet the auditor's requirements, etc. So you're again spending like anywhere between 100 to 200 hours during the audit phase. So just to summarize what I just said, like the conventional process is like 600 plus hours over an entire year, taken away from building your product. You're doing just a bunch of manual, painful, error-prone work. With Sprinto, this entire time gets reduced by 10x. So
Mhm.
you're going to spend like 10x less time in this entire thing, automated. Have the confidence that you're going to go through an audit in a completely seamless manner, and it's just far more simpler. So that's roughly what the contrast looks like.
Mhm. That's great to hear, and especially when you're able to save 10x worth the effort as such, not just time, it's actually the effort also. Now, how does Sprinto go about doing this?
So at the heart of Sprinto is fundamentally we have technology which integrates with a bunch of systems that a modern SaaS company would use. So whether that's HRMS systems that you might be using, or identity or login systems like G Suite or Office 365 or Okta that you might be using, we integrate with your infrastructure providers like AWS, Azure, GCP. We integrate with your version control providers like GitHub or GitLab and Bitbucket and so on and so forth, and so on. So Sprinto has a large number of integrations with tools and systems that you will be already using. Using these integrations and a bunch of other automation techniques, Sprinto is fundamentally, you can think of Sprinto as a giant checklist that's continuously monitoring your environment. And every time we find a gap between the way your environment is and the way it should be from a SOC 2 standpoint or an ISO standpoint, would create an alert for someone on your team. And you and your team's job is simply to react to the alerts that Sprinto creates for you. And apart from that, you can go back to your business. There's nothing else that you need to worry about. Now, seems like a small and simple thing, but this drastically reduces the amount of time, effort, mind space you will be spending on this entire thing. You're not spending any time keeping tabs on these processes. That's Sprinto's job. You're not spending any time collecting evidence. That's again Sprinto's job. Your job is trying to just make sure you're doing the things that Sprinto asks you to do, which would be translated to simple to understand business workflows that you and your team already understand. Like your engineers would know what it means to encrypt database. Your HR team would know what it means to finish a background check on an employee, etc. So Sprinto is like translating complex audit requirements to simple to understand business requirements that your team can follow. And we also distribute these things across various members of your team. So so long as you are just following the alerts that Sprinto creates for you, there's nothing else for you to worry about, and your entire process becomes a lot more seamless. So again, all that 600 hours that you would be spending would get reduced to 60 hours or less when you're using Sprinto, because the software is doing all the legwork that you would otherwise have to do manually.
Nice. That's a great summary. I think what I really liked is when you said, think of Sprinto as a big checklist of all the things needs to be done, and you keep track of it, and instead of the businesses. Because as a founder or a company's IT team or anyone else, they'll have a lot of their own business priorities which they need to look at. And SOC compliance or ISO compliance becomes a bigger task, or one mini project, or in fact, a bigger project on its own. So I can see how Sprinto will be very useful. Now, in terms of where you're taking the company, what's your vision for your company as such?
That's a great question. So, we talked about there being like this massive checklist that Sprinto is, comparing your environment against. Now, there's a little bit of a devil in the detail over there. Fundamentally, the thing to understand is that these checklists or the things that you need to adhere to as a company, the inherent nature of all of these compliance programs is that these requirements need to be adapted to your specific environment. These requirements are not standard. They need to be changed and adapted and fitted to your specific environment. And this is where things starts becoming interesting. Fundamentally, the biggest strength of Sprinto is that our checklists are not templated like most of our competitors do. So these checklists are actually adapted to your specific environment. And what that means is, as you grow as a company, or as you add more compliances that are necessary for you to grow as a company, which is, you might be doing software today, you might want to do ISO tomorrow because you're targeting Europe or Asia Pacific. You'll have to do GDPR if you're targeting Europe. Some companies need to do CCPA, HIPAA if you're dealing with healthcare records. You will have to do PCI if you're dealing with any payment related information. So the gamut of compliances that you need to cover as a company and as you grow as a SaaS company, as well as the complexity of your environment is going to grow as you grow as a company. You're going to have more departments, more people, more servers, more services of AWS, etc. that you're going to use. Sprinto is uniquely designed in a manner that it really, really fits your environment. And what that really means is that you're not pushing things under the rug. You're actually meeting all the requirements in a manner that least amount of work for you while keeping you secure. This allows you to scale. This allows you to, when you scale as a company, you're still fitting your environment, and you're not sort of, trying to put like square hoops in a round holes, and you're not facing any problems like that. So I think the biggest strength of Sprinto and our roadmap is basically to be able to support you irrespective of the kind of compliance that you do or the kind of size or the complexity of your environment. And that's roughly where we see this going.
Got it. That's nice. And in terms of SOC compliance, or let's say ISO, now GDPR is a very big thing. What is the compliance industry looking like? What are the new trends which is happening in the compliance industry as such? Any nuggets over there?
So at a very macro level, the number of compliances that a modern SaaS company is going to have to sort of deal with is just going to keep on increasing. So the two largest trends that I'm seeing that most of us would agree with is the number of business workflows that are moving to SaaS is just growing drastically. Like we all know that software is eating the world and SaaS is eating software. So at a very high level, the amount of SaaS software in the world is growing. But just below that, what's also growing is the number of companies who are going to need some sort of compliance or more of these compliances. That fraction of companies who are going to need these compliances is also drastically growing. It was a time about 5 to 6 years ago where it was only when you're doing like a Fortune 500 deal when you would need it to have SOC 2 or ISO or GDPR or any of these compliances. That roof is coming down more and more. So today, even for mid market and deals and lower, you start needing to getting asked for SOC 2 and so on and so forth. So even if it's a young company, who's only doing mid market deals or what are not exactly Fortune 500 deals, you're still getting asked for these things. So the number of the fraction of times where you sort of get asked for these things is drastically increasing. So that's one large and clear and present trend that we are seeing. The second thing that we are seeing is that SaaS is becoming more and more global. So even though you might be targeting US or Europe or North America as one of your markets, the places where companies are sort of targeting or SaaS companies are being built from, it's spread all across the world. You see pockets in Eastern Europe, Asia Pacific, even Africa for that matter now increasingly who are building SaaS software for the global world. That leads to certain interesting things where the number of compliances that companies tend to sort of need to adhere to is increasing. Like every country or continent is now coming up with its own privacy laws. For example, US has CCPA, Europe has GDPR, Canada has PIPEDA now, and we foresee this trend only increasing. So the number of InfoSec compliances that you would have to adhere to in order to be like a global SaaS company is only going to increase. That's just the trend that we are seeing in the market. So that's the second thing that I'm seeing, that this is going to become a lot more prevalent as we go along than it was about 5 years ago.
Got it. I think that's a really great insight. We ourselves are facing that. We are seeing a lot more compliances. We need to do more compliance checks and other things. That brings me to the last question. Now, in terms of compliance, which compliance would you typically recommend people or companies to go through? There is SOC Compliance 1, Type 1, Type 2, then there is GDPR, then there is CCPA. Typically, the customers end up driving it, but if you had to give an Uber response to any young startup which is looking into SOC compliance or ISO compliance just to get a check mark on their website, what would you recommend? Or should they even go ahead with compliance or wait till they actually have a customer? What's your typical recommendation and with which compliances?
That's a great question. So like short of giving an answer, which sounds like it depends, I'll try and add some nuance there.
Yeah.
So the first thing is it does depend on the nature of your business, the geographies that you're targeting in your GTM, and so on and so forth. In general, if you're targeting North America as a market, it's going to be hard to do this without having SOC 2 compliance. So especially if you're targeting North America as one of your first markets, SOC 2 is like a no-brainer. You should try and get that done, unless you're doing like a purely SMB business, in which case you can kick the can a little bit further down the road. If you are dealing with other markets like Asia Pacific or Europe, you could consider doing ISO before SOC 2 because that's where they have more currency. That's the inherent nature of these things. Of course, if you're dealing with Europe as one of the markets, GDPR starts becoming important from day zero. So the inherent nature of these things depends on the nature of your business, where your customers are, etc. If the nature of your business has to do with, like you're targeting healthcare companies, you're going to try and become HIPAA compliant on day zero again. Or if you're dealing with any credit card information, you'll likely need PCI on day zero, even before. So we see examples of companies who are not yet even formed legally, who need these compliances just for their first pilots themselves. So, it sort of gets into that scenario. Having said that, about when exactly to do this, the thing to understand is each of these compliances have a certain amount of lead time from a calendar perspective. So if you, for example, the gold standard of SOC 2 is what is called as SOC 2 Type 2. And that inherently is going to take you a few months. Like at the very least, it's still going to take you 4 to 5 months. So if you're working backwards from a point where, like you need a compliance in your hand 2 quarters down the line, today is the day to start. So you can't really start this, when you actually need it. You need to be sort of prepared for it, some of these things. So while you'll be spending very little effort during the 4 to 5 months, it's still the certain amount of calendar time that needs to be consumed, because these compliances inherently have an observation period and so on and so forth. So one recommendation I'd make to especially young companies who haven't gone through these things before is that rather than waiting until it becomes like a hard requirement where there's a customer at the door and you need this today, to plan a little bit ahead of it, and at the very least plan about 4 to 5 months before the time that you're actually going to need this, and that will allow you to do this in a smooth manner, and then you're not bending over backwards and just scrambling last minute for this thing. So that's one recommendation I'd make to young SaaS companies.
Yeah, I think that's a very great point, because when the customer is already there with a big check ready to sign in, but if you're not compliant, that's not a great place to be in. Thank you so much, Girish, for sharing your thoughts and insights on SOC compliance and in general, the compliance word as such. Great to have you here with us on the CloudEagle's vendor series as such. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed our conversation as well. Thank you, Girish.
I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me. Thank you.